Let it- Cool. So I'll just briefly go over the kind of like the process of developing this. So essentially the messaging team sits within the media and messaging circle within Animal Rebellion, and our kind of purpose, our mandate, is to develop the kind of big picture messaging for Animal Rebellion. So essentially this is taking our story DNA. So this is the kind of fixed, unchanging parts of Animal Rebellion that have been with us from the start and which kind of shape who we are. And as everyone knows, like, we have our story, our structure, our strategy, and our culture, and these are the kind of fixed things. So what the messaging team does is interprets and kind of works with our story DNA. So this is like things like our frame, which have been like in place since the very start of Animal Rebellion, as well as things like our core messaging, such as, focusing on like animals and climate, and specifically how you can't end the climate emergency without ending the animal emergency, which that was kind of the very early kind of iteration of Animal Rebellion's story. So what the messaging team does is it takes all this like raw material and it develops kind of guides and messaging out of that. So these are things like slogans and social media sometimes, but also things that are designed to kind of just support teams in using our messaging. So there's certain things as our messaging that have stayed the same for a long time, but the way we might communicate them might change. So even though we're still saying the same thing about, we need to transition to a just sustainable plant-based food system, we might experiment and play around with different ways of saying that to be, as effective as we can, and also to kind of make use of like current situations and things like that. So I essentially every time we have like a big thing that we're working towards or planning towards as an organization, the messaging team will write up like a brief or a guide which kind of talks about how we think we should use messaging. And obviously, this is coming from a team, and it's like provide suggestions and hopefully helpful material for teams to use. So that's what we've done this year for G7 previously, and now for the Rebellion and for the Animal Rights March. So the aim of the messaging brief is to talk through a little bit about like how we see like using like messaging as part of like the strategy, which was developed out of the strategy consultation in December, and then also how we can kind of like make use of that through the language that we use in slogans and some example copy and stuff. So it's developed to be as useful as possible, essentially. So this year it was kind of developed within the messaging team, and then we sought consultation from around the organization, and we got lots of really great comments, and then we took that back and adjusted and kind of incorporated those to create what we have. And as always, the messaging briefs are designed to be like the big picture, like the broader scale of things. So we'll always have, different messaging or specific messaging for each action. So we've seen, for example, like with the McDonald's action, they will all have specific messaging which are relevant to like the context, and also like the specific targets that we're approaching. So there's always like specificity in when we're talking about targets. And there's also, specific contents, and specific teams might develop their own messaging based on this to move and kind of push forward what they're working on. So with that, a bit of context of how this happens and the role of the messaging team, I will quickly go through the guide and kind of point out some functionality stuff, and then, chance for questions and discussion as well. So I'm going to share my screen now. So the first bit of this is a little bit about our core message. So thinking about our messaging of a just, sustainable plant-based food system, and also the importance of that being backed by scientific consensus. So one of our key things is, we listen to the science and how that kind of applies to animal farming and the climate crisis. So this is taking, when we're thinking about messaging, we're looking at the needs that have been expressed by teams such as mobilization and strategy and teams like that. And, for example, for the rebellion, our aim is mass mobilization. So therefore, our messaging needs to be able to kind of reflect that, specifically like transformative experiences and kind of bringing in as many people as possible. So we need messaging that's going to be adaptable and flexible, with space for spontaneous action. So everything that we write as the messaging team is aimed to be a guide and advice, basically, from a team who's putting a lot of work into this and has done like a lot of kind of work on what messaging works and how we can interpret our kind of core messaging. But every team within Animal Rebellion is autonomous, and they can use this whichever way they want to. So our messaging has been developed alongside the knowledge that this year XR is focusing on the City of London. So they're focusing on things like subsidies and kind of looking at like the banks and big like finance and stuff like that. And this has influenced the development of our messaging. So thinking about if we're, this rebellion is being organized by XR. So when we're doing actions alongside them, we want messaging that's going to complement XR's messaging, which allows us to kind of increase the power of our messaging and also continue the strategy that we have been using of, I guess, working with XR's messaging to get kind of our messaging, which is a little bit more counter into a more dominant narrative. So we kind of like, this allows us to use existing messaging that we developed for G7 around like just transitions and defunding meat. So I'm going to talk about that in a sec. So one thing that's important is that there are two different messaging strands for the rebellion and the National Animal Rights March, and these are both captured in this document, but they're distinct in some ways. So they've been developed to like integrate with each other and like mutually reinforce each other, but they do provide, they are separate in the doc to just provide some clarity. And like with like functionality as well, like there's some subheadings along the side of the doc which you can see there. So these are things like basically the first bit up until headline messages, so messaging aims, rebellion messaging strategy, and March messaging strategy. That's all kind of like talking about why we're using, or like the approach that we're using that then leads to the actual content. So that's if you're kind of like reading through that, you're not going to get much about like these specific phrases or like specific copy that might be useful, but it's more of points of interest if people want to. And then like from headline messages down, it's a bit more about like specific phrases that we are kind of like encouraging people to use, and also some justification or reasoning why. And then if you go all the way down to what says sample messaging, foundational narrative, that's where you can find like examples of like specific like bits of copy which you can kind of just copy and paste and use in anything that you're doing to, So messaging aims, these have also been used for G7. So these are animal farming and fishing, including environmental and climate groups, mobilizing vegans and animal rights activists around the need for system change, and building coalitions with the global justice movement. So talking about why animal justice and a plant-based food system are prerequisites of social justice. So for the rebellion, our messaging strategy is the same as it was for G7, which is using holistic climate messaging, which includes animal agriculture, and creating compelling, well-integrated messaging that encompasses the full breadth of climate justice, which necessarily includes animal justice. So this is kind of moving towards our milestone of becoming a dominant part and influencing the environmental movement. And obviously, like when we're talking about the rebellion, which is organized by Extinction Rebellion, this is the perfect place to be using that kind of messaging. And then we also want to bring in like animal focused messaging, and this is with the knowledge of two things. One is that we have a massive base of people who are are ready and willing to take action for animal justice, who in the past have been a bit skeptical of animal rebellion. So we want to be able to show that we are a climate justice movement, but we are also an animal justice movement. And the other reason is because we recognize that Extinction Rebellion actually look to us to bring that message in, bring in that animal justice messaging. I think this is really important, and it's a specific and unique role that we play. So if we look at the March messaging strategy as well, so this is focusing on like non-cooperative animal-focused messaging. So what we mean by this is there was a number of concerns raised early on that, you know, we were organizing the Animal Rights March, but that it would just become the Animal Rebellion March. And obviously, while we do, you know, have our first value, principle and value as anti-speciesism, we do talk about the climate quite a lot and animal agriculture. So when we're talking about the march and developing messaging for the march, we wanted to really make sure that this was talking about animal justice and animal rights and bringing groups alongside that. So not just talking about animal agriculture and not just talking about the climate impacts, but talking about other areas of animal exploitation as well, to make sure that this was a space where, you know, all groups, no matter what area of animal rights we're working on, could kind of come along and be part of that. So that kind of brings us into headline messages. So the two kind of slogans that we've been using for banners, for flyers and posters have been, this is the Animal Rebellion, as well as Rebel for All Life. And there's some reasoning why there. One of the reasons is because for the first time in quite a while, like because of the actions that have been happening, like our name has a bit of recognition around it, and we think it's important to build on that. So people who have seen our actions and have been inspired by them, then understand that, you know, things that are happening in the rebellion might be a bit similar to that and might want to get involved. Yeah, so I think it's really important that when we're moving towards these milestones that we have, we're trying to use messaging which kind of references ourselves and like brings us closer to that as well. The two other kind of key headline messages are a just transition must be plant-based, and this is focusing on the XR's like focus for the rebellion, which is finance and pushing for these tangible commitments around fossil fuel subsidies and supporting a just transition, and, you know, bringing in that message that any just transition for these industries must be a plant-based transition, because without that, we're kind of, yeah, shooting ourselves in the foot, as we all know. And the other one is protect the planet, defund meat, which kind of is quite similar. And this is a message that, you know, we have occasionally used, but it's also just kind of like used to develop other messages, like this idea that, you know, we can't keep putting money into this destructive industry. So, and when you're like, I guess when we're developing action-based messaging, these are kind of ideas that we have in mind, or frames that we have in mind around, you know, taking money away from these destructive industries and putting it into positive industries, and also like a just transition for workers, for animals and all that. And then the kind of key slogan that we've been using for the march is that no one is free until all are free. So this is when we're talking about, you know, using animal-focused messaging, but also maintaining our frame of, you know, no blame and no shame, our principles, and also, you know, system change, while also allowing for people to kind of come in with any messages they might have about individual change. But we think that this is a really positive message, which allows us to all come together and unite for animal justice. So this kind of brings me to, yeah, core slogans. So these are, you know, Rebel for All Life, meat and dairy equals climate crisis, which has been one that's been used quite a lot in the McDonald's actions, and of course, plant-based food system. And then for the march, we have things like Unite for Animal Justice, Stand Up for Animals, All Animals Want to Live, and Unite to Defend Animals' Lives. And I think Unite for Animal Justice has been a really key one that has been utilized already in social media and stuff like that. So then we move on to key themes. So these are areas that we think it's important to kind of put some energy into, whether it's designing action around these or kind of incorporating them into our messages, into our kind of outward communication, like that. So the first one is that we need a just transition, and there's some a little bit more about this here. I think some of the key ones are, a just world is one where all beings can live in peace. It is a system that does not oppress some for the convenience of others, and where all people and organizations operate with the pledge to do no harm to each other, our planet, and to all those we share it with. And talking about how we need a global intermovement solidarity and a just transition for all people who work in industries affected by the upheaval of climate and environmental chaos. So this is this is kind of like a theme that allows us to bring in all these different elements of into movement, into group solidarity, as well as the importance of things like workers' rights and global solidarity, while we're talking about specifically like a plant-based food system. We also talk about, another theme of choose to change. So this is all about one of the kind of key parts of Animal Rebellion's frame, which is, system change, and focusing on the government having the power and potential to bring in needed change and defunding destruction. So this kind of theme, it's kind of like a way of talking about our idea, like our key thing of system change, and talking about how people are asking for a transition to a future that's fair for everyone, and this has to be a plant-based future. And in order to protect our future, we need to shift where the money is going. And the final theme that we highlight is animals as individuals. So this is talking about, again, another kind of key part of our frame as Animal Rebellion since the beginning has been that we see animals as individuals, as kind of not as victims, or not as not as victims like exposed to suffering, and we don't talk about improvements to welfare and things like that. We talk about animals as individuals who are resisting and who we represent in this way. So yes, so then this kind of goes into sample messaging and foundational narratives. So I'm not going to read through all this because there's quite a bit, but basically for like functionality stuff, this is where we go into hopefully some things that will just be useful. So if you're writing, social media posts and you want to use any of the messaging that's been developed, or if you're kind of talking or making kind of guides for actions or things like that, you can kind of use any of this completely openly as messaging that's been written by this messaging team to support and help anyone who needs it. I know personally I find it useful when I'm writing captions for social media, just to be able to copy and paste some things and then use them in whatever way I want. So there's some stuff in there about bridging messaging. So this is basically bridging animals and climate and how they kind of come together, and also talking about what this rebellion means and how it's a chance to rise up and come together and unite to rebel for all life. There's a little bit of copy around visioning the world that we want. So this talks a bit about how the world is changing, talks a bit about like the climate crisis and how we're already seeing the effects. And it also talks about that, how we can hold this slide. So how we, a force gathering momentum, and where we have the ability and we have the power to make this change. And it also talks a bit about the science is clear and the future of our food system is plant-based future. So this talks a bit about, it kind of brings in those two things of the scale of the crisis that we're facing, and then also what we need to do to stop that crisis or kind of be part of that change. And then there's a bit in there about system change, which is kind of being covered above, and maintaining a strong focus on the government making choices and bringing in elements of a just transition and choosing to change. And we found that a just transition, out of all the kind of phrases that we use, this most strongly evokes this idea of systemic change without saying systemic change. And like as a team, this is something that we work on a lot, of how do we communicate concepts which might be things that people haven't heard of before, and using words that are kind of in the current conversation. And we've for example, like a just transition is commonly used within when talking about the coal industry and other industries, and by bringing it in to talk about the animal agriculture industry, we can kind of link ourselves to these other in these other movements, which are at the moment a lot more dominant. So then the last little bit I'll talk about is the march and some foundational narratives for the march, as well as some key themes. So the key themes that we have is unity. So, you know, this is obviously trying to bring together people from different parts of the animal rights movement and make it a really kind of empowering experience for everyone to come together. So this is talking about, we're trying to build a new world, and we need everyone. We need all different groups. We need all different tactics, and you know, there's more that unites us than divides us. So another kind of key theme that we kind of bring in is a bit of an introduction to system change. So not pushing this and not kind of making this the only message, because obviously groups are going to bring their own messaging and we want to allow space for that. But talking a bit about how we do need, you know, power and political power and social power, and that we need like a movement of liberation, and we need the government to take action. And then finally talking about like animal justice as a key theme. So how, you know, this system that oppresses animals is constructed and that we can reconstruct it, and we need to kind of unite together to demand like justice for animals and liberation, and that's what unites us, and that's the thing that brings us together. So there's also a little bit of, so all of this is like little bits and pieces of copy that can be used, and there's a little bit of linking messaging there as well. So talking about why kind of we're organizing the march and the vision that we kind of see. And then the final thing in the doc is just hashtags. So it's kind of name utilization, and there might be things that get added to this about like how to use it. But these are kind of some key hashtags that can be used throughout like the lead up to the rebellion, and also probably during the rebellion. And this will probably get like condensed down by the social media team once they figure out like what is gaining traction, what are people really enjoying, what is kind of like the most effective stuff. And I'm sure we'll kind of land on, I'm sure that team will land on like the right hashtags to use, and all that. But for now, like these are just some ideas and some suggestions. So there you have it. Quite a few pages, not as long as some of our other ones, but yeah, hopefully our aim is that this will be a really useful doc. And yeah, as I said, it's completely within teams' mandates to, you know, use this or not. This is our recommendations as the messaging team, and it's what we kind of like strongly encourage groups to use. But obviously, yeah, there will be specific messaging for different actions, specific messaging for different teams. But we've already seen like this be kind of like taken up across like social media, and seeing how people are responding to it, which has been really positive so far. So that's kind of a good sign. And as it says right at the start, like rebellion are times of intense action and rapid change, and messaging needs to be adaptable and flexible, with space for spontaneous action, which remains informed by core fundamental messaging. And what this means is that, you know, when we're in rebellion, there'll be things that come up, and there'll be opportunities, and there'll be moments, and there'll be times where, you know, we have these people have these fantastic ideas, and, you know, there's things that can't be planned when it comes to rebellion, and there might be, you know, actions or press releases or social media that happens which isn't in this doc, but it's just fantastic and really just like captures the moment. And you know, that's always going to happen. And I think the key thing is like we have this core messaging which makes us Animal Rebellion, and when we kind of like know that, and we all collectively understand that, then we can like innovate and be flexible. And that's kind of like the basis of having like organizational DNA, is it allows us to innovate and be flexible. That's it from me. I'm going to stop. But before we go to questions, I'll just check in with Adam and Joe if you wanted to add anything. Adam has disappeared. I'm sure he's there somewhere. Amazing. And yeah, welcome to Sammy and Michael, who I think joined while we're talking. Cool. Yeah, so I guess I'll open up to any questions now about how to use the doc and anything else. Yes, of course. Thanks, Pete. I always do, but that sounds good. Sure.